June 6, 1944, 4:28 a.m. The sea heaves in the dark. Diesel smoke hangs low over grey water. Steel ramps rattle as landing craft slam against waves. Men clutch rifles with wet hands, knuckles white, boots slick with salt and oil. Somewhere ahead, through mist and spray, a thin line of land waits in silence. Then the horizon flashes. Artillery cracks across the channel. Tracers cut the dawn. The invasion has begun, engines roar. Waves hammer metal hulls. A chaplain murmurs a prayer no one fully hears. When the ramps drop, cold water floods in, and the first men step into history. Behind those beaches stands the German Atlantic Wall. Concrete bunkers. Machine guns sighted across open sand. Mines buried under tied lines. Barbed wire coiled like sleeping serpents. For years, Nazi propaganda promised this coast was impregnable. Europe's Western Gate, sealed in stone and steel, and yet, before the sun has fully risen, the fate of that promise is already trembling. To understand why Germany failed on D-Day, we have to move back through the fog of that morning. Back through months of preparation, rival strategies, and fatal assumptions. By 1944, Nazi Germany had been at war for nearly 5 years. The Wehrmacht that once swept across Poland and France in lightning campaigns was no longer the same force. On the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers were locked in brutal combat against the Soviet Union. Entire divisions had been destroyed at Stalingrad and Kursk. Fuel was scarce. Experienced officers were dead. Replacement troops were younger, older, or recovering from wounds. Meanwhile, Allied bombers crossed German skies daily. Industrial cities burned. Rail lines were shattered. Aircraft factories struggled to keep pace. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now stretched thin defending the Reich itself. Still, Adolf Hitler believed the decisive blow would come in the West. He was certain the Allies would return to France. The question was where. The English Channel offered several possibilities. The narrowest crossing lay at Pas-de-Calais. It was the shortest distance from Britain, the most logical landing site, and heavily fortified. German intelligence assessments consistently ranked it as the most likely invasion point. But farther west lay Normandy. Wider beaches. Fewer major ports. Rougher seas. German planners considered it less practical for a full-scale assault. That assumption would prove costly. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recently assigned to strengthen the Atlantic Wall, did not share the complacency of some colleagues. Having witnessed Allied air power in North Africa, he understood something many in Berlin underestimated. If the invasion gained even a small foothold, Allied aircraft would dominate the skies and make counterattack nearly impossible. Rommel believed the enemy must be crushed on the beaches immediately. He ordered thousands of obstacles placed in the tidal zones. Wooden stakes angled to rip open landing craft. Steel hedgehogs to block tanks. Mines wired beneath sand. He pushed for more concrete bunkers, more artillery, more defenses built right at the shoreline, but Rommel faced limitations. Supplies were scarce. Forced labor was unreliable. Coastal divisions often consisted of older soldiers, foreign conscripts, or men recovering from injury. Some units lacked transport. Many had limited combat experience. Worse still, Germany's high command was divided on strategy. Point 1 camp, led by Rommel, argued that armored divisions should be positioned close to the coast. If Allied troops landed, panzer forces must strike within hours. Speed was everything. Another camp, including General Gerd von Rundstedt, believed tanks should be held farther inland as a mobile reserve. They feared that committing armor too early might expose it to deception. Better to wait, identify the main landing site, and then launch a concentrated counterattack. Hitler split the difference. Some panzer divisions were placed under his direct control, requiring personal authorization before they could move. Others were positioned at varying distances from the coast. The result was a fragmented command structure. When invasion day came, that fragmentation would cost precious time. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Allied planners prepared the largest amphibious operation in history. Under the leadership of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a vast coalition assembled ships, aircraft, paratroopers, engineers, and logistics units. The operation was code-named Overlord, but Overlord depended on deception. Through an elaborate plan known as Operation Fortitude, the Allies constructed a phantom army in southeast England. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake landing craft, controlled radio traffic suggesting massive troop movements, even false intelligence fed to German agents. The imaginary force was supposedly commanded by General George S. Patton, whom the Germans respected as an aggressive battlefield leader. German reconnaissance flights observed what appeared to be preparations for an invasion at Pas-de-Calais. Signals intelligence confirmed suspicious activity. Reports flowed into Berlin reinforcing pre-existing beliefs. Even as Allied convoys gathered for Normandy, many German commanders remained convinced the real blow would fall elsewhere. And then there was the weather. Early June brought storms across the Channel. High winds and heavy seas battered both coasts. German meteorologists predicted poor conditions would continue. Rommel himself traveled to Germany to visit his wife for her birthday, believing no invasion would occur during such weather. Allied forecasters, however, identified a brief window of improved conditions on June 6. It would not be perfect. Seas would remain rough. Clouds would hang low. But it was enough. In the early hours of that morning, thousands of paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Gliders crashed into fields and hedgerows. Confusion spread through German rear areas as scattered units tried to regroup. Telephone lines were cut. Bridges were seized or destroyed. At coastal headquarters, reports trickled in. Parachutes sighted. Firing heard inland. Some officers suspected diversionary raids. Others hesitated to escalate alerts. Then naval bombardment began. Battleships opened fire. Shells weighing over 1,000 pounds slammed into German fortifications. The ground shook. Concrete cracked. Communication wires snapped under concussive force, and still, uncertainty lingered at higher command levels. Was this the main invasion? Or a feint before the real attack at Pas-de-Calais? Requests to release panzer divisions climbed the chain of command. But with Hitler asleep at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, senior officers hesitated to wake him. Authority rested at the top. Without it, armored reserves remained stationary. Hours passed. On the beaches, German defenders fought fiercely. At Omaha, American troops faced intense machine gun and artillery fire. Casualties mounted rapidly. Some units nearly faltered under the weight of resistance, yet despite local successes, German forces could not mount a coordinated, large-scale counterattack in those critical early hours. Air superiority belonged to the Allies. German aircraft appeared only sporadically. Allied fighters roamed freely, striking columns of reinforcements moving toward the coast. Bridges were bombed. Roads cratered. Convoys forced to travel by night. Every delay compounded the next. By mid-morning, the reality was undeniable. This was no diversion. This was the invasion, but by then, Allied troops had secured footholds on multiple beaches. Engineers cleared obstacles. Tanks rolled ashore. Supply lines, fragile but functioning, began to form. The Atlantic Wall had not collapsed instantly. It had resisted. It had inflicted heavy losses. Yet it had failed in its ultimate purpose. The invaders were on French soil, and they were not being pushed back into the sea. The question now was no longer whether Germany could prevent a landing. It was whether it could reverse one already underway, and as the sun climbed higher over Normandy, another, deeper problem began to emerge within the German command itself. By late morning on June 6, 1944, the illusion was gone. Reports from Normandy flooded German headquarters. Coastal batteries were under sustained naval bombardment. Allied troops were pushing inland at multiple points. Paratroopers had seized key bridges near the Orne River. American forces were fighting through bluffs above Omaha. British and Canadian units were advancing from Gold, Juno, and Sword. What had begun as scattered alarms now formed a single, undeniable picture. This was the invasion. But inside the German command structure, clarity did not immediately bring coordination to TOB West headquarters. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt understood the gravity of the moment. He requested full release of armored reserves. Yet several of the most powerful panzer divisions were not under his direct authority. They were held in reserve by Hitler himself. The chain of command stalled. When permission was finally granted hours later, it was already afternoon. And even then, movement was not simple. Allied air forces controlled the skies above northern France. Fighter bombers patrolled roads and crossroads. Any column of tanks or trucks that moved by daylight risked immediate attack. Pilots from the RAF and the U.S. Army Air Forces described scanning hedgerows for the glint of armor, diving low, firing rockets and cannon. German units advancing toward Normandy faced constant harassment. Fuel trucks burned. Bridges were destroyed. Traffic snarled along narrow roads. Meanwhile, on the beaches, time worked in favor of the Allies. Naval gunfire provided continuous support. Warships offshore acted as floating artillery platforms. When German strongpoints held out, spotters directed battleship shells onto precise coordinates. The psychological effect was immense. Even reinforced bunkers could not endure repeated direct hits. At Omaha Beach, the situation in the early hours had been perilous. American forces faced enfilading fire from elevated positions. Casualties were severe. Some landing sectors were chaotic. Officers were killed. Units were mixed together, yet small groups of soldiers pushed forward. Engineers blasted gaps through wire. Infantry climbed bluffs using craters as cover. By midday, they began silencing German positions from the rear. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to prevent exactly this scenario, but it depended on concentrated, sustained defense supported by rapid armored counterattack. Without the latter, the former could only delay. Rommel had warned of this months earlier. He believed the decisive battle would be fought at the water's edge. If Allied forces established a lodgment, their industrial and logistical superiority would become overwhelming. He was not in Normandy on June 6. Convinced bad weather ruled out invasion, he had travelled home. When news reached him, he rushed back toward France. By the time he returned to his headquarters, the situation had already shifted beyond immediate containment. Meanwhile, German commanders still feared a second, larger landing at Pas-de-Calais. Intelligence reports continued to suggest Allied forces there remained poised to strike. The fictitious 1st United States Army Group, part of Operation Fortitude, had done its work too well. Even after D-Day, some German leaders hesitated to commit all available forces to Normandy. They worried that stripping Calais of defences would invite disaster if another invasion followed. This hesitation fractured Germany's response. Divisions that might have reinforced Normandy sooner remained tied to defensive plans elsewhere. There was another factor eroding German effectiveness. Logistics. By mid-1944, the German war economy faced severe strain. Fuel shortages limited training and maneuver capability. Synthetic oil plants were under relentless bombing. Replacement vehicles were scarce. Many infantry divisions lacked sufficient motor transport, relying on horse-drawn wagons for supply. In contrast, Allied planners had prepared an unprecedented logistical system. Artificial harbours known as mulberries were towed across the channel and assembled off the beaches. Massive quantities of ammunition, vehicles, and supplies followed the first assault waves. Within days, thousands of tons of material were flowing ashore daily. German planners had assumed that without capturing a major port immediately, the Allies could not sustain large forces in France. That assumption proved false. The Kriegsmarine was largely absent. Years of attrition had diminished its surface fleet. Coastal defences remained, but they could not challenge the enormous Allied armada. More than 5,000 vessels participated in the invasion. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports. The sheer scale overwhelmed localized resistance. In the air, the imbalance was stark. The Luftwaffe managed only limited sorties over Normandy on D-Day. Many experienced pilots had been lost earlier in the war. Fuel constraints restricted training for replacements. Allied fighters dominated daylight skies. This dominance had strategic consequences beyond the battlefield. German reconnaissance struggled to assess the full scale of Allied landings. Commanders operated with incomplete information while their adversary maintained clear aerial observation. As June turned into July, fighting intensified inland. Normandy's bocage terrain, dense with hedgerows and sunken lanes, slowed Allied advances. German units used the landscape effectively, establishing defensive positions that were difficult to detect and assault. Battles around became prolonged and costly, yet despite tactical resilience, Germany faced structural weaknesses. Hitler's increasingly rigid command style limited operational flexibility. He often forbade withdrawals, insisting on holding ground at all costs. Divisions were ordered to counterattack even when circumstances made success unlikely. Strategic reserves dwindled. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union launched Operation Bag Ration on June 22, 1944. German Army Group Center was shattered. Entire formations were encircled and destroyed. The scale of loss in the East eclipsed even Normandy. Germany was now fighting for survival on multiple fronts simultaneously. Back in France, Allied forces sought to break out from a narrow beachhead. Operation Cobra, launched in late July, concentrated air power on a narrow sector of German lines near St. Lo. Thousands of tons of bombs fell in a matter of hours. The ground was torn apart. Communication lines collapsed. When American forces advanced through the breach, German defenses began to unravel. The subsequent encirclement at the Falaise pocket trapped significant elements of German forces in Normandy. Although some escaped, vast quantities of equipment were abandoned or destroyed. The road eastward filled with wreckage. By August, Paris was liberated. Looking back, historians identify multiple layers behind Germany's failure on D-Day. Tactical courage among German soldiers was not absent, nor were fortifications entirely ineffective. Resistance at several beaches was fierce and inflicted heavy casualties. The failure lay not in a single bunker or machine gun nest. It lay in misjudgment of location, in divided command authority, in delayed release of reserves, in underestimating Allied deception, in overestimating the defensive power of concrete alone. In a war machine already strained by years of attrition, and beneath all of it, a deeper shift had occurred. Germany no longer possessed the strategic initiative it once wielded so effectively in 1940. Instead of choosing the time and place of battle, it reacted. Instead of concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points, it dispersed strength across vast fronts. By the time panzer divisions fully engaged in Normandy, the window for decisive reversal had narrowed dramatically. Still, in those first 24 hours, the outcome had not been guaranteed. Omaha teetered. British forces faced stiff resistance near Cannes. Weather remained unpredictable. Supply lines were fragile. What if armored reserves had struck at dawn instead of afternoon? What if German intelligence had not been misled? What if air superiority had been contested? History rarely hinges on a single moment. But sometimes, a handful of hours can tilt the balance of continents, and in Normandy, those hours slipped away. By the evening of June 6, 1944, smoke drifted over the Norman coast. The tide carried wreckage back out to sea, burned landing craft, splintered obstacles, bodies in the surf. The sand was torn and cratered, but it was no longer empty. More than 150,000 Allied troops had come ashore. Germany had failed to throw them back. In the days that followed, the true weight of that failure settled in. The German High Command had always believed that if an invasion came, it must be crushed immediately. The Atlantic Wall was never meant to endure a prolonged siege. It was designed as a barrier, not a battlefield. Once breached, its concrete bunkers became isolated strongpoints rather than a unified shield. The crucial opportunity had existed in the first hours. Rommel understood it. Rundstedt sensed it. Even field officers along the coast felt it as reports piled up. If armored divisions had been unleashed at first light, striking disorganized beachheads before artillery and supplies were firmly in place, the fighting might have unfolded differently. But they were not. Hitler's insistence on centralized control slowed decision-making at the very moment speed was essential. His distrust of subordinates, sharpened by years of plots and perceived disloyalty, narrowed the flexibility of his generals. Orders had to move upward before they could move outward. By the time full authorization came, Allied fighters ruled the skies. Columns of German armor attempting to approach Normandy were spotted quickly. Rocket-firing Typhoons and P-47 Thunderbolts swooped low. Roads became death traps by daylight. Even when panzer units reached the front, they often arrived piecemeal, lacking coordination. Air superiority was not just a tactical advantage. It was a strategic cage. Meanwhile, Allied logistics proved astonishingly resilient. Despite storms that damaged one of the artificial Mulberry harbors, supplies continued to pour across the channel. Engineers repaired beaches. Temporary piers were reinforced. Pipelines were laid under the sea in a project known as Pluto, allowing fuel to flow directly from England to the continent. Germany had gambled that without a major port, the Allies would falter. Instead, the Allies built their own. There was also a deeper imbalance at work. By 1944, Germany's industrial capacity, though still formidable, could not match the combined output of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. American factories alone produced aircraft and vehicles at rates Germany could not sustain under bombing pressure. The Normandy landings were not an isolated effort. They were the physical expression of a vast industrial machine operating across oceans. As July turned to August, German forces in Normandy fought with determination. Battles around Caen were grueling. Villages changed hands repeatedly. Tank engagements scarred fields and orchards, yet every loss was harder for Germany to replace. The Falaise Pocket in August marked the breaking point. Allied forces converged from north and south, trapping significant elements of German Army Group B. Though some troops escaped eastward, tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment lay shattered across roads and fields. The destruction in Normandy crippled Germany's ability to mount effective defense in Western Europe. Within weeks, Allied armies surged across France. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. The front moved rapidly toward Belgium and the Netherlands. The failure on D-Day had opened the door. The battles that followed pushed wide. But the consequences extended beyond geography. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the Reich as unstoppable. Victories in Poland and France, early advances into the Soviet Union, and sweeping offensives had built an image of invincibility. D-Day shattered that illusion before the world. Occupied Europe saw proof that liberation was possible. German civilians, listening to foreign radio broadcasts despite restrictions, sensed the shift. The war was no longer distant. It was closing in from both east and west. Inside Germany's leadership, desperation intensified. Hitler's orders grew increasingly rigid. He demanded counteroffensives that strained dwindling resources. The Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, known as the Battle of the Bulge, was one such attempt to regain initiative. It achieved temporary surprise but ultimately failed, consuming precious fuel and manpower. By then, the outcome set in motion on the beaches of Normandy was unfolding toward its conclusion. In April 1945, Allied forces from west and Soviet forces from east converged on Berlin. The Third Reich collapsed within weeks. Looking back, historians do not attribute Germany's failure on D-Day to a single mistake. It was the convergence of many, strategic miscalculation about the landing site. Successful Allied deception through Operation Fortitude. Divided command authority over armored reserves. Delayed decision-making at the highest level. over-reliance on static defenses, loss of air superiority, strained logistics. A war fought simultaneously on multiple fronts. Each factor alone might have been survivable. Together, they were decisive. There is a tendency to imagine history as inevitable, as though the outcome was written long before June 6, 1944. But that morning did not feel inevitable to the men wading through surf under machine gun fire. It did not feel predetermined to German defenders bracing behind concrete embrasures. It felt uncertain, violent, fragile. History often turns not only on strength, but on timing, on perception, on whether leaders recognize reality quickly enough to adapt. On D-Day, Germany reacted slowly to a rapidly changing battlefield. Its command structure, once admired for operational brilliance, was constrained by mistrust and centralization. Its air force, once feared, could not contest the sky. Its reserves, once decisive, arrived too late and too scattered. The Atlantic Wall stood as concrete proof of preparation. But concrete alone cannot compensate for flawed assumptions. Today, the beaches of Normandy are quiet. The bunkers remain, weathered by wind and salt. Cemeteries overlook the sea, rows of white markers facing the horizon from which so many ships once emerged. They remind us that technological power, industrial capacity, intelligence work, and leadership decisions converge in moments that reshape the world. The failure of Germany on D-Day was not merely a military setback. It was the turning of a tide that had begun years earlier. It marked the moment when occupation gave way to liberation in Western Europe, and when the end of the war in Europe moved from distant possibility to approaching certainty. And it leaves a question that still echoes across those shores: if decisions had been made faster, if assumptions had been challenged, if air power had been contested, would the waves have carried a different outcome onto the sand, or had the balance of power already shifted beyond recall? The answers lie not just in bunkers and battle maps, but in the human choices made under pressure, in rooms far from the sound of the surf, choices that change the course of history.